of how religion legitimates the economic relations of Gastonia. And he gave a bunch of examples. For example, religion is funded by the capitalists. Many of you talked about that. Religion is constrained and by the capitalist. Religion blesses the role of the capitalists in the community. Religion is divided, so you have different churches for basically the poor workers in the community and different churches for the capitalists. And religion basically kind of can pacify, in many cases, in the churches of the workers in that community. You should have also picked up a little bit in Pope II. There was some dissent. So there were some ministers, there were some people, members of churches that weren't quite comfortable with the state of affairs, but basically were somewhat powerless to do anything about it. What's really interesting is that Billings, who studied a similar situation, as I mentioned before, in the coal mines of Appalachia, studies an exact similar economic relationship, but says, hey, I found an example where religion doesn't do these things, where religion is actually helping to build a union, where religion is criticizing the economic conditions, where preachers are preaching out against the inequality and struggling for better rights for the people that work there. What's the difference? And what Billings basically finds is that a couple things. In this case, religion is independently funded. So these religious groups aren't funded by the owners of the mines, but instead are funded by the people who go to them. They have their own, what we might call indigenous leadership. So the leaders aren't recruited from capitalist finance centers. No, they're actually taken from the people themselves. That these religious groups bring in all sorts of religious resources. So they bring in all these songs that they then turn into protest songs to protest the conditions of the mine. What's interesting here, and this is why I bring this up, this puzzle, is that these things are the exact sort of things that Marx and Gramsci pointed to as ways to criticize dominant and hegemonic ideology, especially as they tried to encourage it in their Marxist movements of the times. But they also wrote these off as possibilities that weren't going to happen for religious groups. But here we have evidence of the way religious groups can do this, especially in regards to class. So, as Marx said, religion can kind of express suffering. Billings finds out that this happens in the songs they sing. They sing all sorts of songs about suffering in the way that, in terms of these religious groups that were Christian, that Jesus suffered, and therefore the suffering that the coal miners are experiencing is that type of suffering. So kind of using, if you will, or kind of us thinking about this in terms of Marx theory, hey, there's this religious group that can do that. They can kind of point out suffering. And then thinking about religion in terms of what Gramsci said, hey, wow, these organizations are independent, so they can break away from the dominant hegemony of the local mining area and can start to think about things on their own. And hey, another thing that Gramsci said is if you develop independent indigenous leaders whose training and income is not based on the predominant economic relations of the day, well then lo and behold, you get some free thinking. You have ability of these leaders to kind of point out inequality. And what Billings shows in his article is that all of this led to successful efforts to try and actually overturn these conditions. Unionizing efforts to get schooling for the children, to get better pay, to get stores that weren't controlled by the capitalists. So the overall picture here then is that the nature of religious groups' relationship with dominant social conditions, whether as said by Marx, Gramsci, or Zuckerman, is really dependent on social context, all right? And in particular, it's dependent on these kind of crucial things of religion's independence, religion's response to changes in the social environment. There's nothing inherently natural about religion that says it will only go along with dominant ideology. No, instead, if we start to look at kind of these particular factors of religion, and especially how those factors line up with the social conditions of the time, there's always the possibility of religion to kind of engage change and to look at the social world differently. In other words, there's always the possibility of religion to not be conservative and justify the current conditions, but for religious ideology along with religious organizations to be able to look at reality differently and propose a different idea of reality. Next week, we're talking about this in terms of religion taking this in a violent direction. Religious groups that develop their own ideological resources, their own organizations, but do it in a way that leads to kind of violence or leads to using politics for what we might call negative religious reasons. And then two, look at it in terms of religious groups that engage religious resources for positive social reasons in terms of mobilizing social movements. Okay, so that's it for now. Keep up the good work. In your reading for the critical reading assignment for next week, hone into the main arguments. You don't have to kind of review and cover everything, but hone into the main arguments about what our author, Mark Juergensmeyer, is saying about the connection between religion and violence. Okay, take care. Have a good weekend. Bye.